Thank you. And good evening. I'm Diane Lewis. I'm the Chief Programming Officer and EVP for the Paley Center for Media. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to a very important and timely conversation, preserving survivors' legacy through Holocaust stories. Tonight's program is part of our ongoing effort to examine media's powerful shaping influence and unique ability to raise awareness around the alarming rise of anti-Semitism. This conversation and all of the events in this PaleyImpact series on the role of media in combating anti-Semitism seek to shine a light on how media can educate, inform, and make an impact on this vitally important issue. As I look out in the audience tonight, I'd like to take just a brief moment to welcome a few very special guests here with us this evening. Our esteemed chairman of the board, Frank A. Bennick Jr. is here, with his incredible wife, Mary Lake. Frank Bennick is serving in his 32nd year as our chairman. The only, yes, the only one to have held that position other than Mr. Paley himself. Welcome and thank you, Frank. Tonight's program is made possible by the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation, and we are sincerely grateful for their most generous support. It is an honor to have President Laura Barron and Executive Director Jean Korf here with us tonight. Thank you so much, Laura and Jean. Never before has Paley's mission been more vital, as media has become the undisputed connector in these unprecedented times. And Paley is uniquely positioned to meet this moment and convene important and impactful conversations with renowned and respectful thought leaders, such as the esteemed panelists that we have with us this evening. Holocaust stories, whether scripted or nonfiction, remain a powerful tool to understand one of the darkest chapters in human history. They help to inform and educate younger generations about the systemic horrors of the Nazi regime, while honoring the experiences of the survivors and victims. Amid the rising tide of anti-Semitism, Holocaust narratives endure as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked prejudice and can inspire an audience to promote tolerance. It is our hope that powerful discussions like these can help to shape the public discourse and influence the negative behaviors and actions that contribute to the crisis of anti-Semitism. We thank all of you in the audience, especially our Paley members, who continue to support this effort and our mission. And if you are not yet a member, we invite you to consider joining our special Paley membership community. Funding supports important programs like this one, and membership includes special VIP benefits and exclusive experiences. Now, onto our program. This evening, we are honored to welcome to the Paley stage Aviva Kempner, director and producer of A Pocketful of Miracles, A Tale of Two Siblings; Heather Dune McAdam, author, director, and producer of 999, The Forgotten Girls of the Holocaust, based on her book; Susanna Fogel, executive producer and director, A Small Light; Georgia Hunter, author and co-executive producer of We Were the Lucky Ones, based on her historical novel. Following the screening of trailers from the Holocaust films and TV series recently completed by our panelists, we will be joined by our moderator, Annette Insdorf. Annette is a renowned and respected professor of film at Columbia University's School of the Arts. She's the author of the landmark study Indelible Shadows, Film and the Holocaust, and her latest work is Cinematic Overtures, How to Read Opening Scenes.
So as you can see from these clips, the Holocaust continues to be such a vibrantly dramatic subject for filmmakers, both fiction and documentary, whether made for theaters or for television, streaming, combination. Our panelists this evening will focus on how and why Holocaust stories are being told in the 2020s. Two of our panelists represent fiction miniseries at their best: A Small Light from 2023, We Were the Lucky Ones 2024. And the other two guests are the creators of documentaries that illuminate personal as well as collective history. I'm going to introduce each one briefly. then pose a few questions, and at the end, we'll have a few questions that have come in from Paley Center members. So, Georgia Hunter is the author of the best-selling novel, We Were the Lucky Ones, based on her family's World War II experiences. It has been published in 20 languages and engendered the 8-part miniseries created by Erika Lipez. Airing on Hulu, it follows one Polish Jewish family that endures dislocation, loss, dispossession, and fear, but endures over 7 years of exile on 5 different continents. Welcome to Georgia Hunter. Aviva Kempner is the award-winning filmmaker of The Life and Times of Hank Greenberg, about the famed baseball player who faced anti-Semitism. You Who, Mrs. Goldberg, about the television pioneer Gertrude Berg. And Rosenwald, about the philanthropist who created 5,000 African-American schools in the Jim Crow South. Her latest film is A Pocket Full of Miracles, and she is working now on a documentary about the great screenwriter Ben Hecht. Welcome to Aviva Kempner. Susanna Fogel directed the first 3 episodes of A Small Light, which, by the way, I consider to be the best motion picture of 2023, even if it was an 8-part series. It tells the true story, as you just saw, of Miep Gies. And Susanna Fogel's screenwriting credits include Booksmart, which earned her a BAFTA nomination as well as a Writing Guild Award nomination. She wrote and directed a film that I thoroughly enjoyed called The Spy Who Dumped Me, starring Kate McKinnon. Recently directed Winner, which premiered at the 2024 Sundance Film Festival, about reality winner. A Small Light won the Humanitas Prize in Limited Series and the Gotham Award for Best Breakthrough Series over 40 minutes. Welcome to Susanna Fogel. Heather Dune McAdam, the director of 999, The Forgotten Girls of the Holocaust, is based on her book, 999, The Extraordinary Young Women of the First Official Transport to Auschwitz. It is a powerful documentary of commemoration and resistance about the 1,000 young women who were deported from Slovakia in March of 1942. And it was adapted from her first book, Rena's Promise, from 1995. Welcome to Heather Dune McAdam. Now, as you probably figured out, all of the films and series that you represent tonight are inspired by actual events. I'm going to start with Georgia Hunter, since you served as co-executive producer and consultant throughout the adaptation process. What was the greatest challenge in transforming a 416-page book into a motion picture in 8 chapters?
The job of doing that. Thank you so much for having us. Thanks to the Paley Center, and thank you all for coming tonight. It means a lot that you're here, and I'm so excited to be here with these 3 wonderful women. So the biggest challenge, I think the story has so much breadth. 4 continents, it's actually 9 years start to finish in our series, also 12 leads. So pulling that together, taking that 400-something page novel and condensing it into 8 hours of content was really, really challenging. I am still in awe of our writers and what they were able to accomplish. I'm very lucky that I'm dear friends with one of our directors, Tommy Kail, and he asked if I wanted to be involved in the process, and I said absolutely every step of the way. So I was able to be in the writer's room and listen and learn. We have Michelle here, who's also in the writer's room with us, part of the production. And we were there every day for 5 hours a day for 5 months. And watching them break down this story and transform it for the screen was remarkable, and especially how closely they stayed to the truth. So I'm the granddaughter of Addie Courts, who Logan Lerman plays in the series, and I took it upon myself back in 2008 when I first set off with my little digital voice recorder to capture the family story and interview relatives to try to do it justice. I just wanted to tell it in a way as truthfully as I could, to capture it, to honor the relatives whose stories unfold, and also to tell it in a way that my kids and their kids and so on could read it and relate to it someday. And I think everybody, from Tommy to our amazing showrunner, Erica Lopez, to all of our heads of departments, all of our writers, top down on the call sheet, took that to heart. And that was the refrain over and over again, was we just want to do the story justice. So I can't tell you how they did it, because it was magic in my mind. I'm not a screenwriter, I'm a novel writer, but I got exposed to this world, and it was a masterclass in screenwriting. And I think having the book there as sort of the template and knowing it's a true story and that we weren't going to deviate from it unless we absolutely had to, or we had to condense here and there or create a bridge perhaps for time, for sequence, but we stayed so true to the story. And I think they appreciated that so much of the content was there. We had an incredible research drive. I provided all of my family photos and documents, and then we had a researcher, Daniel, who then took that times 10, and they could draw from that as well. So it took a lot of time and energy, but I'm so proud of the way it turned out.
With good reason. I have a similar question for Heather. Your documentary is anchored not only in your book, but recent interviews, archival footage, evocative color drawings, and quite effectively, as you know, I love this, that she includes scenes from two of the first fiction films ever made about the Holocaust, The Last Stage from Poland and Capo, which was a European co-production. It took 11 years, I gather, to make the film. What was the greatest challenge for you in adapting, and this is a 450-page book, into a documentary? How did you decide what to leave in or take out?
Yeah, I realized I made a different movie and it didn't work. And we cut the first part, and you saw the women speaking, and every time we stepped away from the women talking about their story, the energy, the passion deflated. So I said to my co-producers, we have to use my book. That's the outline. And then it had to be, what's the story we want to tell? I could make this movie much longer, right? It was really hard to be short. And I needed a lot of help making it shorter, because they're all precious to me, and I wanted everybody in it, and I couldn't have everybody in it. So it really became telling my audience, the story that you don't know. And the themes were that I really wanted to hit. Is I wanted to touch on, these are the first Jews in Auschwitz. They're the first girls and women in Auschwitz, and they survived 3 years. That's longer than any Jewish man. Eli Wiesel was there for 6 months. And they're teenagers. So I wanted to tell a sorority of survival, the sisterhood. And I love that Edith used to say, we were teenagers, we lost our tempers, we didn't want to get up in the morning, we were kids, we stole from each other. And I really wanted to show you they're human beings. They're great role models, but they're not perfect. And they came into this horror, and those who came out were able to come through it by helping each other. And that, for me, is the message of the film. It's also, the last line is that war serves no one. And so I really had to use my survivors, what their messages are for us, and keep my own messages out so that you get the pure. And I want you to feel like you're sitting next to them, like I did, and hearing their voices, holding their hands.
That's great. Aviva, about 44 years ago, I remember that you decided to make Partisans of Vilna, which was a groundbreaking documentary about Jews fighting Nazis in the Vilna ghetto. So I'm curious, why turn to your personal family story now, so many years later, and what challenges did you face in sort of reshaping the Holocaust testimonies that your mother and your uncle gave to the USC Shoah Foundation?
Thanks. First, I have to do some thank yous myself. It's great to be on this side of the auditorium at the Paley Center, especially since I've admired the work that you've done for years, and I'm good friends with Ron Simon. And thanks to Mary Lake and Frank for supporting the film that you saw. And most of all, thanks to Steven Spielberg, because if he had not started the Shoah Foundation 30 years ago, my mother and uncle never would have talked, and we wouldn't be seeing this film. So it means the world to me how important it was. But also Annette, even before I met her, I had read her book, her wisdom. Of course, her friendship's very important to me. But, you know, everyone sort of fits in and for me being here tonight. And coincidentally, the Laurie Foundation had been very helpful to me in the past with Hank Greenberg. So what do you do? 2.5 years ago, I turned 75. And yes, Mother, I'm saying how old I am. My mother would have been horrified, right? If I had ever said, just like Annette said, let's do what my mother said. Let's put our lipstick on before we come on stage. So in any event, I was worried 2.5 years ago about Holocaust denial, because already I had made several films and I was working on that topic with Hecht. I never dreamed where we would be today, I mean literally today, and worrying about anti-Semitism. And the expression, go back to Poland, is nauseating. I just want to say that clearly. And you can look at each one of our films, but especially those of us who are making films about Poland. I mean, this is what the life they had. And actually, my mother and uncle had a very rich life in Poland, but they do talk in the film about certain things, anti-Semitic things. And in fact, my uncle did go back to Poland after he became very successful, but he never went back to Auschwitz. So I think that what happened to me is, you know, you got to go personal. And I don't know how many children of survivors are in the audience. I know Annette and I am here. But my mother would never talk about it. I only knew one story about my grandmother. Almost everything in the film was that when I saw the testimony, my uncle would never talk about it. As a matter of fact, my cousin was on stage, and he had survived Auschwitz. And my cousin said when he was a little boy, he asked my uncle, "What is that mark on your arm?" And my uncle said, "It's my phone number." And for years, my cousin scratched his head and he said, "There's not enough numbers." But of course, that's also, again, Steven Spielberg. Schindler's List, I think, opened the door a lot. And I think we owe our fellow filmmakers, as well as ourselves, to keep it ongoing. So I think that answers your question, that I think the legacy was a personal one, but wanting, I'll talk about it later, give back for people to see it and use that as an example of these things did happen. Identify with these people. You know, there are 6 million stories. We're telling, what, about 20 of them, you know, and still not enough.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah. And Susanna, if you could tell us a little bit about how you got involved in A Small Light, and at what point was the decision made that you would direct episodes 1, 2, and 3, as opposed to, let's say, 4 or 5? You know, how did you come in, and how did that breakdown happen?
Well, Joan Rader and Tony Phelan, who created the show, I'm actually filling in for Tony tonight. He had a health emergency. He's going to be fine, but it's supposed to be him up here. But basically, Joan and Tony had been researching Miepke's, the woman who hid the Frank family, for years and years and years. It had begun when they took their son to the Anne Frank Museum, and they realized that their son was the age that Miep was, and they looked at their son, who was kind of a mess of a young 20-something, and thought, he couldn't hide anybody, much less deal with this situation. And so they thought that there has to be some sort of way to tell the story of like a young 20-something sort of regular person who's put in this very high-stakes situation because of the moment in time that they're living in. And so they had been researching this for many years with the help of a researcher. And by the time it came to me, it was sort of an extensive outline for what the show could be, but it wasn't yet a script and it wasn't yet sold to a network. So they were looking for a director to direct at least the first episode, if not the first few, to sort of kick off the tone and help the casting and kind of help set the aesthetic, like the look and feel of the show. And what they were looking for was someone who did not have a historical drama background. They wanted someone who could sort of tap into the energy that Meep had as a 20-something young woman who was sort of defiant, and she wasn't interested in a domestic traditional life, and she didn't care about marriage or kids, and she also had a really vicious sense of humor in the best way. And so they were interested in someone who had either a background in some sort of comedy or a director who could kind of like help harness that and lead with that. And then obviously could handle the aesthetics from there, but not be slavish to the period in a way that would make it feel like a history lesson. So they came to me, and I happened to be looking for something that, especially in COVID, I think so many people, artists really questioned what stories they were telling, and people who had sort of been on that hamster wheel of just trying to make entertainment for years, myself included, were like, oh my God, what does it all mean? What does community mean? What does family mean? We're all asking ourselves these questions in that particular couple years. And so I was looking for something that had a little more resonance in that way and could contribute to a cultural conversation in that way to sort of justify the reason that we're all making art, which is in this very challenging business. So I was looking for something like this at the time, and to try to lend gravitas to the story of this funny woman and try to put this heroine in a sort of iconic position for people to really look up to her. And it was just an interesting way into the Anne Frank story that I hadn't been exposed to. I knew who Meep was because my mom had lived in Amsterdam after graduate school. So I was aware of her, and also just growing up Jewish, like kind of heard the stories. But I didn't know as much about her as I wanted to. I did think that it was somewhat liberating to tell the Anne Frank story from her perspective, because I think there have been so many iterations of the Anne Frank story, and there's like it's sort of a difficult canon to step into if it's really focusing on Anne, just because I think it's so iconic and it's so symbolic and it's so synonymous with like a Holocaust story. But with Meep, who wrote journals, but wasn't as famous, obviously, there was some invention that could happen. Like Meep was our sort of way into a story that was able to breathe and then include other stories that they had heard, kind of in sort of a loose telling of what happened to Meep. I think I've answered your question and then answered other questions that you didn't ask. But yeah, so it came to me through that, and then I immediately fell in love with it, and we just did the dog and pony show of pitching it around to all the buyers and saying who wants to make this, and Nat Geo was instantly like the absolute best partner, and they were like, we really want to make this, we want to put this on the air, this is not going to just sort of dwindle in development for years, and they linked arms with us, and then honestly, like everything we wanted, like the casting choices, that we were so aligned with them, and they were just the greatest allies for us.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And I honestly, when watching, and by the way, I was hooked by episodes 1, 2, and 3, and therefore watched all the rest. Had you not done such a good job, I might not have seen 5, 6, 7, 8. But Meep Geese, I mean, she strikes me as such a role model for contemporary audiences, especially young women. She is sassy and she can be nasty, and you offer through her this cross-section of rescuers, perpetrators, and victims, each one individuated in the course of the series. Now, we have mentioned, especially thanks to Aviva, anti-Semitism, which is the sort of subject that hovers behind all of the works. I want to ask each of you, to what extent you consider your motion pictures a tool to combat rising anti-Semitism? Maybe we'll start with Georgia.
Sure, again, I set out in 2008 to try to be the family historian, so I never would have imagined, you mentioned the same thing, sitting here now in this day and age and it feeling so relevant. It's heartbreaking and terrifying to see where we are today. And I think none of us would necessarily think of it as a tool. I think we tried to tell the story of one family through their eyes, and truthfully, in the moment, living history without projecting the end. Even the cast would say we had to keep reminding ourselves in this moment in the script, we didn't know how it would end. And I think in doing that, you allow viewers to relate in a way that feels real, and that takes away the history, the sepia tone, the dust, and in that, you can take away whatever you will, right? And in our story, it is unique in that my family doesn't end up in the camps. They scatter far and wide. They are in hiding. They are posing as Aryan. They're being kept in the homes of Poles willing to put their lives at risk. And so no one was trying to tell a lesson by any means. We weren't trying to make any sweeping statements, but here we are. And here's a story about a family and what happened to them. And I think it's impossible not to draw parallels. And what excites me the most is when I hear about young people watching it or families watching together. And my next door neighbor just came back from her freshman year in college. She said, all of my roommates and I were all watching it together. And for that age group and younger, and more I'm getting asked to speak at schools, and like Beverly Hills High just assigned the book for their summer reading. To me, that is the most incredible opportunity to reach a younger audience who may or may not even know about the Holocaust, to relate in a way that feels like, well, that could be me. Because until you step into the shoes and hearts and minds of someone who went through it, you can't empathize. And I think we need empathy right now. And so I hope it brings that.
Okay. Heather?
This is, it's such a big question, and I'm not Jewish. My family's Quaker, and I come to this story simply because a survivor asked me to write her story, and I felt like I should do that and give it to her. And in the middle of it, I said, "This is a book," and she said, "I know," and so we wrote a book. And then I wrote another book, and then I wrote another book. But Rena, who was the first survivor I worked with in Rena's Promise, she had a couple of statements that I really cling to. One was she wanted to build. I run a foundation, and it is our mission, and it's based on what Rena said, to build a more ecumenical world free of racism, prejudice, and hatred.
Oh, hallelujah.
And that is the mission of the film. And the other thing she used to say is, I do not hate. To hate is to let Hitler win. Mm. Rena did not understand anti-Semitism. And I loved that about her. She loved Gentiles. She didn't understand. It was like there was no connection there. And I'm sort of the same way. I just don't understand why people can't get along, because we all breathe and we all have blood, and we all come from the same very small person who they found in Africa, Lucy. I mean, I don't really get it. And I do feel, as an educator and as an author and a filmmaker, that one of the ways that I reach out to people is to break through that isolation of them. And if I can get you to see the girl, the teenage girl and the 90-year-old survivor that I'm talking to, and if that turns that little light on of empathy, then you stop seeing them and you start seeing us. And that, I feel, is the mission of the arts. And I think that's a great mission, and it's a great purpose. And then I just think we just have to pour love, when I meet hate, and I do, and I meet those deniers, I used to get really hackles up and snarly, and now I just feel like, Obi-Wan Kenobi. I feel like I'm letting it bounce off me. I'm not taking it in. And I think that is really important, because if I get angry, then they have something to fight me on. And if I don't, and I just stay centered and loving and peaceful, then they're sort of lost.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay.
When I was planning the film, I purposely did Life Before and, of course, During and Survivor. But both my mother and my uncle had such chutzpah to get through it all and character, but the resilience and what they made of their lives. My mother, as you see, became an abstract painter, but she said for each one was for one of the 6 million. It's not your typical, quote unquote, Holocaust art. My uncle became very, very successful, but what he did with his money, he tried to help all the religions. He had this whole role model of helping people. So I think their example as survivors. But also, I've gone back to redo Hank Greenberg, and I forgot to mention the editor is somewhere in the wonderful editor, Marion Sears Hunter, is in the audience. And for me, Hank Greenberg is the best way I can especially teach young people about anti-Semitism. In the late 30s, every time he went to bat, there were these horrible anti-Semitic remarks right there in Detroit where Father Coughlin was, or Ford was passing out the Protocols of Zion for free. And there was the big rallies, down the street. But every time he went up to bat, what did he do? He'd hit a home run. And that's very much the message of the film. And that's why maybe I've always chosen, underknown heroes. So I'm hoping that film, again, out, will get people going and thinking and saying, this just can't be the way we are. I agree with you. And I have to say, I've been working on trying to get the hostages back every week in Washington and just get a ceasefire. We've got to work on getting along because it'll just continue and more people die. And if there's anything, at least I've learned from the Holocaust, is that we have the right to, all have the right to live, and that wars does not accomplish anything. And any leaders that perpetuate that in lies are not the ones we want. You know who I'm talking about. I had it right in.
Susanna?
Yeah, I mean, I think I appreciated your very Quaker answer about how you deal with people that have hate and negativity. Yeah, I mean, I think like with anything, the more you can just draw people into the humanity of the characters and show them as complex people. I think that Joan and Tony's vision was really to show Miep's personality, to show the full freight of her personality in dealing with this. And because it was a story about a Gentile woman, although she was played by a Jewish actress, helping these Jews, it was a story about allyship and a story about a person sort of making a humane decision, not from a place of politics or symbolism, but just from her heart. So in a way, it was like, I think they felt like there was a need for a story about that, alongside stories about the victims and the perpetrators of event like the Holocaust. It's like they're also all of these regular people who can choose to either ignore what's going on,
Right.
pretend it's not happening, because especially in places like Amsterdam, there were still people going to the ballet, the zoo was still open, like people were still kind of living their lives, and in a way watching the ways in which Miep was really unable to do that. Even before kind of everyone was dealing with the blackouts, there was a period of time where you could choose to turn a blind eye to it, as everyone was sort of wondering, is it bad? Is it as bad as they're saying? What about now? What about now? What about now? I think we all like relate to that in our world now. We're all looking at each other saying, when's the panic button time, So that was a really relatable and ultimately pretty timeless experience that if history is repeating itself, we're all kind of looking at each other like with that question now. So I think just the idea that it's showing a woman who was really unable to look away from this injustice even long before she was forced to make the choice, was the way that they kind of wanted to model for people, even people who are not directly the victims of the conflict in that moment, how to sort of connect and just make small decisions that can make big differences. So I think that's their angle on the whole. That was the show's angle on the whole thing, was that we all have a million little decisions in our day of how much we're going to think about other people or not. And now especially sometimes there's like a tonnage of bad news when you look at the news, and you can't, obviously you can't spend all day kind of like wringing your hands over every conflict in the world at every moment, but
If you can.
well, you can. You can, but not if you
Unless you're leaving.
You can, but not if you make comedy. Yeah. So anyway, it's really like a story for allies to connect into what is ultimately a story that helps to fight anti-Semitism and discrimination of any kind.
Yeah, I agree. For Georgia, I read that your second book, One Good Thing, is a coming-of-age historical novel set in Holocaust-era Italy, to be published in early 2025. My question, are there plans for a TV or film adaptation?
I literally turned in the manuscript today, so it's a little. And I have a call with my film agent next week, so we'll see. It's a much sort of smaller in scope story. It follows one young woman and sort of through her tells the story of the Holocaust, but also and what was happening in Italy, which for me personally, I knew very little about going into it, and that was part of the reason I chose to write it. And also, my parents met in Italy, so it's kind of why I'm here. Neither of them are Italian, but they lived there, loved it, combined 17 years. So yeah, I hope that through her story, you'll learn a little bit about what was happening in Italy. She has a best friend from Greece, so a little bit of Greek history in there as well. But it's also, at its core, which I think is sort of the theme for all of us, the story of just a young woman coming of age, a very ordinary young woman forced into an extraordinary time to make decision after decision after decision and not knowing how she'd end up, which is also similar to the characters and my relatives, and we were the lucky ones. I mean, over and over again, split-second decisions, and I think that's where a lot of the luck came in, because they didn't know how those decisions would end up. But yeah, that's hopefully out in March.
Well, if it will be dramatized for the screen, how much simpler and easier is
Exactly,
it to
yes.
follow one little story than the massive work that you did before.
Yes.
And Heather, I gather your new novel, Star-Crossed, is a nonfiction love and resistance story set in Nazi-occupied Paris, subtitled A True World War II Romeo and Juliet Love Story in Hitler's Paris. Did the experience of making 999 inform your writing, and might Star-Crossed be adapted into a film as well?
Oh, I'd love that. It actually, in France, L'Histoire d'Annette Insdorf is in French and played in the Jewish film festivals, but it's a narrative of the, we were doing the research on the book while Philippe Leguet was making the film. So the director of that film and I often do panels, and I tell everybody in the audience what is wrong in the film. Or I say, Philippe, why didn't you, I just saw him in Paris last week, why didn't you do this? It's so much more dramatic. And he's like, because they didn't tell me that. Anyway, the survivor, Michelle, is 95, and I was just visiting her in Paris last week. Definitely, I mean, when I started in Star-Crossed, and I always think of it as Romeo and Juliet in Hitler's Paris, I just have to say. I just knew how to weave together the multiple narrative and the history. And Annette Insdorf, she's on the first Jewish transport of French Jewish women into Auschwitz. That's June 22nd, 1942. And 1942 is my area of expertise in Auschwitz and women's camp, because nobody's really focused on it. And I ended up doing it back in the 90s. Michelle, her sister, inherited an archive of letters and art. So Annette went to school at the Beaux-Arts, and she was good friends with Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, and she hung on the Café Flore, and she was very, very saucy, like your meat, and irreverent, and I just loved her. And so it was a much simpler story, the weaving together of letters and narrative that is nonfiction, but she writes such active letters that you can turn them into scenes, which is fabulous. And personally, I will say, this is sort of weird, Annette only survives a couple months in Auschwitz. So I got to Auschwitz and I knew exactly what to do. Boom, boom, boom. And I knew what I was writing, and I knew the entire territory. And I was out of it in a short period of time. But she's also in the Depot and Les Tourelles in Paris. Those two prisons really kicked my ass. Because I'd never been there. And the entire time she's writing letters saying, I'm going to get out soon, and and we do this, and we're learning languages, and bring me a new pair, my clean panties and a bra, so when you pick me up, it's so innocent. And the women of the Parisian transport, they put on makeup and freshen their nail polish before they arrive in Auschwitz. And then when they're strip searched, Hess comes in with his cronies and they laugh. Paris has come to Auschwitz. It's just, intense. Yeah.
Aviva, you are now completing your documentary about Ben Hecht, who I hope you know is the Hollywood screenwriter par excellence and an activist who, during World War II, he was one of the few vocal people from Hollywood trying to alert Americans to the peril of Jews in Europe. What are you finding out about his motivations and techniques that you think are important for our own age?
Yeah, before I say that, the one thing I forgot to mention is the importance of rescuers. It's something in my mother's story and my uncle's story. That's why I love the Anne Frank story, that we didn't have enough rescuers. And one of our Jewish friends is Dr. Eva Fogelman, who is I just can't remember the title. Do you remember Eva?
Conscience and Courage is her landmark book about rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust.
And I think the reason, and also it's in We Were the Lucky Ones. And I guess it's always that I wish there had been more, which goes back to Ben Hecht. So I was the same man, funder, who asked me to do the documentary on Moberg, the real story of Moberg, and the catcher who was the spy behind home plate, said to me, do Ben Hecht. So when I started looking at his movies, anywhere from Notorious to Front Page, well, it's the play that it's based on, I thought, oh my gosh, Godard said 80% of all scripts. And then I started realizing what this man had done. He was first a journalist who, after World War I, had covered Germany and what was happening, and I think started really seeing what was happening. And he very early, in the late 30s, had a series of chapters, fiction, and in one chapter on these short stories, he predicted that 2 million Jews were going to be killed before anyone else. And then, of course, the stories started coming out, and he, like others, really got to action. I mean, he had been born Jewish, but there was nothing in his practice or identification being Jewish. But his second wife, Rose, was very Jewish. And he got very involved, and he ran into and started meeting these Palestinian Jews called the Bergson Group, who were first trying to raise money for a Jewish army. And then when they realized what was happening, they switched to that. I live in Washington, D.C., most of the time when I'm not here. And they switched completely to trying to rescue European Jewry. But the problem was the contradiction. On one hand, FDR was very much supported by the Jewish vote. Sound familiar? That's another story. In any event, but he kept on saying, well, wait, we don't want to make it a Jewish war. And in all fairness to him, we were worried, should we get, people were against us going in. And there was, again, as I said earlier, anti-Semitism in the late 30s. They organized in 43, just before the Bergson Group and Hecht. He wrote the big page ads. There were never page ads, yet enough on the subject of saving European Jewry. He wrote 2 pageants. Some people in Hollywood were involved. The second pageant, later on, after the war was done, starred for his first role Marlon Brando. Have you ever heard of him? And they used the money from that. The play was actually up the street to buy a ship they refurbished and took Holocaust survivors who had, survived the war to Palestine. And of course, the ship got diverted. But it is such a compelling story of, once you understand what's happening, do you get called to action? And he himself was Jewish, but a lot of the people who were involved were not. And the problem is, it might have to be a 2-part. I was meeting with people who were in the film today at lunch, including David Denby, who has written extensively about Ben Hecht, about do I do a 2-part series or not. But it really is, again, isn't all our films about moral dilemmas of what you do, both rescuing your family and others? And I guess, especially as a second generation, I always think, what would I have done? And of course, we don't know unless, for years I've been trying in my political work, maybe trying to fight evil. But it again is the universal all-time question of, you know, do you rise to the occasion? Do you do something? And that's why I think all our films are so important, especially now. And just briefly, I was just at a college at Penn State, and there was a very young girl. We showed the film, and then after we had a class, and she raised her hand, and she said, you know, I just found out recently, just as my grandfather was dying, he told my father, we're Jewish. They had never known that. So I think there's very important thing, another reason why these stories have to come out. You're saying you did the book, you know what it is, and I think each one of us have that aspect, and I hope you as an audience and supporters of our films, because for me, it's trying to get into as many high school and colleges with all my films aren't streamed yet, but first I have to pay off a lot of music rights for Hank. You will not believe how much Benny Goodman and the Andrews Sisters cost, especially 25 years later. But seriously, I think that it is a question we all have to ask ourselves. And it was really, in final conclusion, in terms of Ben Heck, it was Morgenthau and the Treasury Department and the people under him that realized that the quotas were not going to Jews, that they weren't satisfying them, and they were letting people in. And, you know, we have the same situation with, do we let people in who are fleeing other countries? And that's why at a brief time I was an immigration lawyer until the DC bar flanked me twice and I became a filmmaker. My mother also hated me ever saying that, but I give them credit for making me a filmmaker, including people like Barbara Koppel in the audience, who I met just before I decided to become one, and was inspired by her in Harlan County and other work.
Okay. I have many more questions for these panelists, but I've been told that I should address some of the ones that came in from Paley Center members as well as interns. This comes from the intern Madison McAllental. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. I would like to ask our filmmakers how they are emotionally impacted as they do research on one of the most horrific eras in human history. Do you get overwhelmed?
Oh, yeah. Are we going in order? Or?
I think anyway. Well, Susanna, I
In
was
order
about to
of
ask
most
you.
overwhelmed to least.
I wouldn't even presume to give a hierarchy here. But I was about to ask you a question when I realized what time it was. So if you don't mind starting it off.
I will start, sure. Yeah, I mean, what Georgia was saying about just the directing actors who you're sort of trying to stay present with them. So in the research phase, yes, it's very overwhelming. When you're actually making the thing, you have to be kind of radically present with your actors and encourage them to be that way too, and not play the stakes of the end. Like, we're looking back knowing how it ended. We know how the Anne Frank story ends for Anne and her family. So and because it's such a larger than life story, it was, the challenge for us was actually not to think about it in that way, in that more global way while we were shooting. So radically immersing yourself in it and being very emotionally impacted up to the point where you actually have to be present on the set and try to encourage the actors not to think about that. So it was a bit, it's like emotional whiplash doing that. But yeah, it's very overwhelming, the research aspect of it. But practically, the decisions are very micro, especially as a director. And you have to just sort of align yourself with the emotional present tense of how those people are feeling. Like, we can see pictures of people when their clothes were threadbare, and we think of clothes from the 40s because we see them in vintage clothing stores and they're faded. But actually, like, Anne bought this bright blue sweater because her favorite, whatever. Like, you have to sort of make decisions aesthetically that are based on like the joy of the moment that they were feeling before the big event happened. So you kind of have to dance all over the place. Anyway, yeah.
I understand that. George?
I think it rings so true for us too, and it was the balance of the lighter moments with the horrific moments that I think kept us all afloat. The fact that they were a family that kept living despite the circumstances, and there were romances, and there were babies born, and there was music being made, and sibling rivalries, and bickering, and loving moments. And so I think that helped everybody. I know me personally, I got used to it after a while, but my first few days on set were very overwhelming. And they weren't even like hard scenes. There was just one scene, the first one was my grandfather waiting at an embassy in France trying to get the paperwork he needed to go home to Poland. And that was, he didn't talk a lot about the war, but he did tell the story that his mom wrote him a letter from Poland saying, don't come home for Passover this year. And he was like, what? No, I'm coming home. Like, don't be crazy. How bad could it be? And standing behind the monitor and seeing Logan's face in that moment and the anguish and the sadness and the hope all at once, and I just lost it. And so I was like, oh gosh, I'm in for a roller coaster of a ride here, and it was. But by the time we got to scenes, there's this horrific scene where my great aunt Mila is sent to a killing field, and she has to try to find a way out. And we broke it down over 4 days of shooting, and it was the micro. You know, we was like, you got through it, and it'd say cut, and everybody would, and then get into a conversation and kind of laugh. And we really did try to keep it light in between, and the cast got so close, and there was a lot of tennis and poker and silliness happening in between, I think, to keep everybody buoyed. And you never knew when it was going to hit you. It might even be a happy moment that hit you the hardest, because it was that little bit of joy that came and that unexpected sound from the little Felicia that you're like, contradicts the things that's happening around her, and it hits you. But then we all kind of just rallied around each other. When one person would go down, we'd pick them up and be like, you got this. It was very emotional.
We had that too, like just the fact that there were things we learned about, like we learned that Anne brought her tennis racket to the annex because she's like, you never know, I might, and they brought board games, and you know what I mean? Like all those details kind of hit you harder sometimes, just because because you do know how it's going to end, but you also are like with her in that moment. But one thing I just wanted to add was like the surprising moments of levity that came on the set included like running into some survivors when we were shooting in Amsterdam who came to the set. They wandered over, and we were shooting in one apartment complex. We shot this razzia where they were rounding up and arresting all the Jews, and a man came out of his apartment with a friend of his, and they were like, we've lived here. She had watched her parents get arrested when she was a little kid. And the two of them were standing there, and like, but they were like, this is cathartic for us. They were not traumatized. We were like very sensitive to the idea that they might be traumatized by it, but actually we were so much more worried about their mental health around it than they were. And like the guy was like, she had a lot of notes. She's like, I don't know, like the screaming's a little much. Oh, okay. And then the guy, Jack, he wanted to get like a selfie with all of the Nazi extras. And we took pictures of them, and then we took all these other pictures on set. Like there were guys that were like waiting and having a snack at craft service, and one of them was feeding a popsicle to a cat in his SS uniform, and we took pictures. Like, I mean, it's just like you have to we found ourselves just like wanting the outlet. But the survivors and the people who actually had experienced this were some of the lightest, because they've spent so long like kind of converting the trauma into humor in that way, that we kind of took their lead, but they were like putting a lot of that vibrancy out into the world of our set as well.
Aviva and then Heather.
I think for me, if I compare like Partisans, my first film, which I produced, I didn't direct, and Pocketful of Miracle, I choose underknown heroes. So in a way, fighting back is inspiring in its own way, especially if you're not hearing the stories growing up. I mean, I learned the Holocaust reading Exodus at 13 about Dove and Karen, and I remember reading The Wall in high school, and then on my own, Miller 18. And when I decided to go make Partisans, I thought it was a Leon Uris version. Luckily, the head of Yad Vashem handed me Ghetto in Flames. So I think the fact that they fought back and there were women in it, and it was just, it's also true in your movies. With me, my brother and I hadn't heard the stories, my cousin had, and I finally said, okay, Aviva, you're gonna go look at the testimonies of your mother and uncle. And the minute I did, there was a film. But there was also stories how my uncle was jealous how well my aunt, who was murdered in Auschwitz, played the piano, that she was, and how you'll see the little scene in the trailer, how romantic my grandparents were dancing. I mean, just these little facts. All of a sudden, I thought I had captured my history, even as painful. And the 2 times I went to Auschwitz, I don't know how it is for you, Annette. It's like the loneliest times. You bring a Yorkshire candle, you know that's the burial place of your relatives. But when my uncle tells the story, which I have in the film, that the French prisoners came and they all taught them you can eat frogs. It wasn't quite escargot, but you could eat frogs. It's something about humor or those little facts. And then, of course, after the war, how they really did find each other and how, you know, how my mother had stood up to the Germans. I mean, all of a sudden, you wish they were there. I mean, you're just so proud of them. Finally, at one of the screenings, my brother turned to me and said, "I'm so glad you made this film." So it's a personal story, but I think it also gives, like I said, the high school or the college students that are seeing it, or anyone, I think any immigrant, it gives you, I think, a feeling of how resilient people can be. And I'm proud that that was also in my family.
I'll just say very briefly that when I wrote my first book on the Holocaust, at one point I went into the kitchen, it was first thing in the morning, to make coffee, and I looked at the Mr. Coffee, it was the 90s, and I couldn't fathom how to make coffee. And I ended up sitting on the floor sobbing.
Yep.
And I hear my partner in the other room, "Are you making coffee?" You know, and I was so, it was just looking at that coffee maker and I was like, this is real. This is real. This is not fiction. Right. This is not a made-up person. I know somebody who was there, and this is my job. And you know, it's not easy. I have a regime. I often wake up at 5. I work till 2. I walk my dog in between there, and then I go swim for like a mile. And I have to do something very physical. I have to meditate. I have to be in nature. I have to be quiet, and I have to commune. But I will say, the first time I walked into Auschwitz, it was like, I knew it like the back of my hand. I knew where everything was. I mean, you know, the tour guides were following me around. And I was led into Block 10 where my girls had been, and I knew, you know, where the block elder was. I knew where the bunks were. And I had this incredible sense of I was the camera, and that their stories had come through me, and I was now looking through their eyes and walking through it. And a Buddhist monk once said to me, when you go to Auschwitz, you must go with no sticks in your river. You can't have ego. You must go completely open, or it will get stuck on you. So I always wear amulets. I do salt baths when I come out, but I spend a lot of time there. And I always make sure I am not walking in with any garbage, any ego, any sense of any sense of self, because I have to do my work for survivors, and that cannot be ego-based at all.
Wow. This is going to be our last question.
I watch a lot of Hallmark movies.
I do Seinfeld.
I
watch
used
a
to
lot
overeat.
of Seinfeld.
I've gained a lot of weight making partisans. I've learned that these stories shouldn't affect. And when you see what my mother talks about eating, you see where I get it from. But because you hear about starving, and all you want to do is go eat.
Yep.
For a while there, that was my trick.
The last question comes from Jason Friedman, a Paley member. Aside from your own projects, what other recent movie or TV projects about the Holocaust have resonated most with you, and why?
Is it okay to say some books instead? Because I feel like I actually tuned out Holocaust-themed media when we were working. We've been working on this now for like 2.5, 3 years. I just couldn't, I didn't want to overlap. You know, I don't know, I just kind of needed to keep my head space and my heart space with our show. But I always recommend a couple of books that when I was really early in my research into my family history that kind of opened my eyes and my world into, okay, you can tell these stories in a way that feels relatable, and that you kind of just forget that you're reading about history. You're just in that moment. And one of them is called The Invisible Bridge by Julie Oranger, and it's also her kind of based on her grandfather's story, and it's this beautiful long novel, but I consider it poetry. It's so beautifully written, and also starts in France, and it's her grandfather, and he's, I think, an architect, and he reminded me a lot of my grandfather, and at its core, it's a love story. And again, it just kind of made me realize you can tell the story of the Holocaust as a backdrop to a coming of age, to these people just trying to live every day and adding the humor and adding the romance and adding the music and whatever it is. And then the other one was City of Thieves by David Benioff, and that one kind of read to me like a movie. And I remember being like, wow, you can write about this subject in a way that, again, you just get lost in it. And I remember it so vividly and with humor. He did a really good job of integrating humor into that story. So I'm going to think on the TV and film aspect, but for me, those two books really stand out in my mind.
Great. Anyone, Susanna?
Oh, I mean, I'm thinking back to all the research. Tony gave us all his packets of his favorite movie, Soldier of Orange, and all of these other books to read. The Invisible Bridge is another one for me. I'm trying to think of most recently. I mean, recent as of the last couple of years, I'm trying to think of what I've consumed besides a couple of episodes of your show, which I really enjoyed. And I'll have to think about that.
And I'm going to just, forgive me, a little PS, because I happen to know that Susanna studied English literature and film at Columbia University. Just want to give that a little context
Didn't
here.
she have some of your classes?
No, didn't actually
No,
take my
I
classes,
didn't,
but I knew
Missed
about
out.
her.
I know, I'm sure.
And also, we were the lucky ones. Your story editor, Anya Mexon, is an alumna of Columbia, and she's the one who alerted me to We Were the Lucky Ones. So that's
an
great that
amazing
I have a whole sort of generation of students who have become sensitized to excellent work, especially related to the Holocaust.
I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to going to. I'm about to show my new film at the San Francisco Jewish Film Festival,
Oh,
which I've
great.
never been to before.
It's wonderful.
I've heard that, and I'm really looking forward to just going.
is
and
Winter?
seeing film. Winter, yeah. It's they have like a Take Action spotlight, and so I would say that I'm like representing the Jewish contingent in the Reality Winter movie, but she actually converted in prison, and I spent Passover with her this year. That's a digression, but yeah,
Wow.
it's hard to get the Seder plate going in South Texas. To really source a lot of that stuff, odd places, but every wine is sweet wine, so that helps.
This is true.
Well, Annette had said to me, maybe you want to talk about the films that influenced you. First of all, We Are the Lucky Ones. I think I've recommended to 100 people. And I don't always believe that you have to have Jewish casting. Like Helen Mirren in Golda Meir totally nailed it, although smoking drove me mashugana. But the fact of the matter is, I really think you should be commended that every character was Jewish and did such an excellent job. And I mean, that could be a whole discussion for another panel. I'm looking forward to seeing the two of yours. But the movies that so influenced me, of course I mentioned Schindler's List. Anything Agnieszka Holland did on the Holocaust.
Yeah.
She's my friend, but also a
And
mentor
may I
to me.
add that Agnieszka Holland's latest film, Green Border,
Right.
is currently showing at the Film Forum. I did a Q&A with her Saturday night after
Right,
one
you
of the
should-
shows. It's one of the most powerful films, and it's not about the Holocaust, but you can't help but feel parallels
Green
in the
Border,
stories of
yeah.
migrants.
So Europa, Europa in Darkness. And she wrote Korczak, right?
That's right.
Yes, that Vida directed, and that was so important. I was debating whether I should say this publicly. I really did not like Inglourious Bastards. And the reason I didn't like it is I am so worried, and this is not true of the fiction that, I mean, I know, I've seen yours, and I saw the preview of yours. I'm worried that 100 years ago, people think that's how Hitler died. And I am so worried about that I think it's really important, and that's especially us who do documentaries, who try so hard. And it's not that you don't do it as features, that's so much an issue. And it pleases me to no end that there are new versions of the resistance theme that, I started 44 years ago, both Partisans and Four Winters. Although oftentimes the people in it are the kids of my main characters because they're no longer alive, which has to do with, I think, why we see more and more films still happening to get the stories before these people go. And again, it goes back to the Shoah Foundation because a lot of us draw from that material, and I'm going to shout them out another time. Steven Spielberg for doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just amazing what that archives was about. And I'm just so lucky, although not surprised that both my mother and uncle gave such good testimonies.
Heather, do you have any particular titles?
Well, I totally relate to Georgia. When I'm in the midst of a project, I don't do any Holocaust. I watch Seinfeld, right? Reruns and I need to laugh,
How about Curb
and I need a really sure laugh. And if I do anything Holocaust, it's the Schindler's List one where he's caught making out with his girlfriend. But I have to have laughter. But when I'm not in a project and I'm not doing my research, I love to read. I think part of my problem with Holocaust, it's the same problem I have with horror films. I can't lose the imagery, so I have nightmares. So I'm really, really careful what I watch. Documentaries I can handle, but fiction is really difficult for me. So I read a lot, and I loved East West Street, which is a brilliant book. The Hair with Amber Eyes, brilliant. I'm always looking for other nonfiction authors who are doing interesting things with narrative and deep, deep archival research. I spend a lot of time in archives. That's my happy place. And when I'm not working, I'm resting my eyes. And my brain, and my heart. Yeah.
Understood. Two things in closing. One is that I'm not sure that these are the very best, but you're probably aware that there's a whole subgenre of films that is increasingly visible, and that is returning to Auschwitz or Poland on the part of second or third generation. So in October, I believe, you're going to see the release of Jesse Eisenberg's directed film, and he stars in it, called A Real Pain, which was very successful at the Sundance Film Festival, starring Eisenberg and Kieran Culkin as cousins who decide to do the Poland tour of the Holocaust areas. And right now, a film opened quite recently called Treasure. It's currently playing at the AMC on 42nd Street, at the City Cinemas 123 on 3rd Avenue. It's adapted from Lily Brett's novel, Too Many Men, and it stars Stephen Fry and Lena Dunham as a father and daughter who return to Poland, from where Edek was taken to Auschwitz. So they're here. The only thing I can say is we should have another hour to talk about all the other things that I didn't get to ask, casting, for example. But to answer one of the questions, it seems to me that one can become so easily debilitated by doing either research on the Holocaust or even watching films about the Holocaust if you let yourself feel too much. But speaking for, I think, artists as well as educators, once you are overwhelmed by the reality of what took place, of the lives that were destroyed, and you can take that next step into artistic mediation, where you start to not only bring these people back to life in a mediated way, but you also use art as a means to overcome how debilitated the process can make you. I believe that there's so much more that we can all be making and talking about, but that will be for another panel. Thank you so much for joining us.